The smell arrives before the sound. Creosote and pine resin, black grease and something older, something mineral, like iron that has absorbed decades of heat and never fully released it. The forest floor is still frozen in the pre-dawn hours of a February morning somewhere in the northern timber country where the tree line stretches without interruption for 200 miles in every direction. There are no roads here, there are only the rails. The locomotive sits idle on a temporary spur line. Its boiler is a horizontal cylinder of wrought iron and riveted steel plate, 9 feet in diameter, fed by a firebox that has not gone cold in 11 days. The pressure gauge reads 140 pounds per square inch. The needle trembles. The men who watch it know what that trembling means. The fireman's name is recorded nowhere. He is 23 years old, possibly 24. He came north from a mill town in Michigan or Wisconsin. The records differ, following the seasonal wages that the timber companies posted on courthouse boards and church doors. He has been stoking this engine for 6 days without relief. His hands are wrapped in burlap strips because the gloves wore through on the 3rd day. At 5:47 in the morning, he opens the firebox door to feed another load of cordwood into the flame. The riveted seam on the rear crown sheet, the iron plate that separates the firebox from the water space above, has been weeping a thin mineral scale for 9 days. Not enough to notice, not enough to stop, enough to matter. What happens next takes less than 1 second. The steam that escapes in that single second contains enough thermal energy to cook a human body through its clothes, through its skin, through the first quarter-inch of muscle tissue, in the same duration it takes to blink. He does not die immediately. That is the cruelest part. The forest does not stop. The timber does not wait. By noon, a replacement fireman is climbing the iron steps of a different engine 2 miles up the spur line. The logs are moving again. This is the story of the machine that built the northern frontier and of the men it consumed to do it. There is a particular kind of progress that does not ask permission. It does not arrive with debate or deliberation. It does not wait for the infrastructure to be ready, for the regulations to be written, for the men operating it to fully understand what they are standing next to. It arrives because an economy demands it, because somewhere, in a paneled office in Chicago or Detroit or St. Paul, a man with a ledger has determined that the northern forests represent an incalculable fortune, and that fortune will not extract itself. The portable steam boiler engine was that kind of progress. It was not invented carelessly. The engineers who designed it were serious men, trained in the emerging disciplines of thermodynamics and materials science, working with the best metallurgical knowledge their era possessed. They understood pressure differentials. They understood tensile strength. They understood, in the abstract language of calculation, exactly how much force a riveted iron cylinder could theoretically contain. What they could not calculate, or chose not to, was the gap between laboratory conditions and a frozen spur line in the Wisconsin Northwoods, where a fatigued fireman is operating a machine that has not been properly inspected in 3 weeks, in temperatures that contract iron fittings by measurable fractions, feeding a firebox with whatever combustible timber falls to hand. That gap was not an oversight. It was a decision. And this is the central paradox that the history of the northern logging frontier cannot escape. The very machine that made industrial-scale timber harvesting possible was, by its essential nature, an uncontrolled detonation waiting for the precise conditions of its release. The boiler engine gave the timber industry its reach, its ability to push deeper into wilderness, faster than any animal or human labor force could sustain. It compressed decades of forest clearance into a single industrial generation. It moved mountains of timber to rivers and rails and markets with an efficiency that would have been incomprehensible to the men who first swung axes in those forests. And it scalded men alive to do it, not occasionally, not as a statistical aberration that engineers and operators could reasonably classify as acceptable loss. Boiler explosions in the American logging industry between 1870 and 1910 killed and maimed workers at a rate that, had it occurred in any visible urban context, would have generated immediate legislative intervention. But the northern logging frontier was not visible. It was, by definition, remote. The men who died in boiler explosions in the Wisconsin pinelands or the Michigan Upper Peninsula or the Minnesota timber country died in places where no journalist was present, where no photographer had set up an apparatus, where the nearest coroner might be 40 miles away over seasonal roads. That did not exist in February. The question this history demands is not simply mechanical. It is not merely an inquiry into the metallurgy of crown sheets or the physics of steam pressure. It is a moral question dressed in industrial clothing. Who decided that the rate of expansion was worth the rate of death? Who looked at the gauge, not the pressure gauge on the boiler, but the larger gauge that measured productivity against human cost, and determined that the needle was reading acceptably? Those men left records. Their letters survive in archive boxes in Milwaukee and Minneapolis and Lansing. They wrote in the careful, measured language of industrial management. They discussed boiler incidents as line items. They calculated replacement costs, not of the machines, but of the men. And then they ordered more cordwood, and the fires were stoked again, and the pressure climbed back toward the red mark on the dial, and the forests of the American North continued to fall. To understand why the boiler engine was driven beyond its limits, you must first understand the scale of what America was trying to build, and the speed at which it demanded to build it. Between 1865 and 1900, the United States underwent a physical transformation without precedent in the history of human settlement. 35,000 miles of railroad track became 190,000 miles. Cities that had been frontier outposts in 1850, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, became industrial metropolises of hundreds of thousands within a single generation. Every mile of that railroad required timber for ties. Every building in every expanding city required timber for framing, for flooring, for the interior structures that held plaster walls and supported roof loads. Every mine shaft sunk into the iron ranges of Minnesota and Michigan required timber for shoring. Every wagon road cut through prairie settlement required timber for bridges. The arithmetic was simple and it was merciless. America needed wood at a scale that the eastern forests could no longer supply. The white pine forests of New England and New York had been largely exhausted by the 1850s. The industry moved west with the same inexorable momentum as settlement itself, following the tree line into Pennsylvania, into Ohio, and then with gathering velocity into the great northern tier of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, where the white pine stands were so dense, so tall, and so extensive that early surveyors struggled to find adequate language for them. One government surveyor, writing from the Chippewa River Valley of Wisconsin in 1848, recorded timber stands of white pine so continuous that a man could walk for 3 days through closed canopy forest without once seeing direct sunlight. The trees were straight-grained and clean-limbed, averaging 80 to 120 feet in height, with trunk diameters of 3 to 6 feet at breast height. A single acre of prime Wisconsin pineland contained enough board feet of marketable timber to frame 12 houses. The timber companies understood this arithmetic immediately. By 1870, the upper Midwest had become the epicenter of American lumber production. The Chippewa, Wisconsin, and Menominee river systems were being used as natural conveyors, floating cut logs from inland harvest sites to downstream mills with a seasonal efficiency that required enormous upstream labor to maintain. The mill towns of Eau Claire, Oshkosh, Muskegon, and Saginaw were processing timber at rates that generated fortunes of industrial scale. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, operating out of Rock Island, Illinois, was assembling the most powerful timber syndicate in American history, purchasing Wisconsin pineland at prices that would appreciate tenfold within a decade. But river driving had a fundamental constraint. It was seasonal, limited to spring flood conditions, and it required that harvest sites remain within practical distance of navigable waterways. As the most accessible timber was exhausted, the industry pushed deeper into the interior, into terrain that no river drive could reach. This is where the crisis became structural. The northern logging frontier was not simply distant, it was hostile. The terrain of the upper Michigan Peninsula, the northern Wisconsin highlands, and the Minnesota timber country presented obstacles that animal and human labor alone could not overcome at the scale the market demanded. The ground froze to depths of 3 and 4 feet. Seasonal mud rendered wheeled transport impossible for months at a time. The distances from harvest site to mill or railhead stretched to 20, 30, 40 miles of wilderness that contained no infrastructure of any kind. The industry needed a machine that could go where rivers did not reach. A machine that could generate its own power from the fuel that surrounded it. A machine that could haul loads of cut timber across frozen ground and temporary rail lines without the biological limitations of horses or oxen, without hunger, without fatigue, without the need for rest. What it needed, in other words, was a boiler on wheels. And what it got was exactly that, with all the consequences that followed from deploying a contained industrial explosion into conditions that its designers had never fully anticipated, operated by men whose training was measured in days rather than years, maintained by companies whose commitment to inspection was inversely proportional to their commitment to quarterly output. The forest did not care about any of this. The forest simply waited, as it had for 10,000 years, for whatever came next. What came next arrived on iron wheels, trailing steam and smoke, pushing deeper into the tree line with every passing season, and the men who fed its fires did not always walk away from it. The machine did not arrive fully formed. It evolved, as all industrial tools evolve, through a series of incremental adaptations, each one responding to a specific limitation of the version that preceded it, each one pushing the fundamental engineering envelope a fraction further than the metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances of its era could comfortably sustain. To understand the logging boiler engine at the height of its deployment, you must trace its lineage backward through several decades of industrial experimentation, through the foundries of Ohio and Pennsylvania, through the machine shops of Michigan and Wisconsin, through the iterative intelligence of men who solved problems with iron and fire because those were the materials available to them. The stationary steam engine had been present in American industry since the early decades of the 19th century. By 1840, it was driving sawmills, textile mills, and grain processing facilities across the northeastern states with reasonable reliability. It was large, fixed in place, and fed by permanent water supplies and established fuel depots. It worked within a controlled environment where trained operators could monitor its behavior continuously, where maintenance schedules could be observed, where the consequences of mechanical failure, while serious, were mitigated by the presence of established infrastructure. The critical conceptual leap was portability. The first serious attempts to mount a functional steam boiler on a wheeled chassis for agricultural and industrial field use occurred in England in the 1850s and were adopted in America with characteristic velocity. By the late 1860s, portable traction engines, self-propelled steam units capable of moving under their own power across open ground, were appearing in Midwestern agricultural contexts, primarily for threshing operations. These machines were crude by later standards. Their boilers operated at relatively modest pressures, typically between 60 and 90 pounds per square inch. Their iron plate was thick and conservatively specified. Their operating speeds were slow and their loads were modest. The timber industry looked at these machines and saw something the agricultural sector had not fully imagined. If a portable traction engine could haul a threshing apparatus across an Illinois prairie, it could, with appropriate modification, haul a train of log-laden sleds across a frozen Wisconsin logging road. The operational logic was straightforward. The engineering challenges were not. The transition from agricultural traction engine to dedicated logging locomotive required solving three distinct problems simultaneously. First, the machines needed to generate substantially higher tractive effort, the pulling force necessary to move loads of cut timber that could reach 60, 80, and eventually 100 tons per train across grades and terrain that no prairie surface had prepared their designers to consider. This meant higher boiler pressures, which meant thinner iron plate to save weight, which meant reduced safety margins. Second, the machines needed to operate continuously, in remote locations, without access to the maintenance infrastructure that stationary mill engines took for granted. They needed to run through the night, through extreme cold, through the accumulated stress of frozen water in fittings and contracted metal in joints, maintained by whoever was available rather than whoever was qualified. Third, they needed to be economical, not in the engineering sense of operating efficiently, but in the commercial sense of costing as little as possible to purchase and operate, because the timber companies that deployed them were extracting maximum profit from a finite resource and had no philosophical commitment to capital expenditure beyond what immediate production demanded. These three requirements, higher pressure, continuous remote operation, minimum cost, formed a triangle of constraint that the logging boiler engine could never fully satisfy simultaneously. Every design decision that addressed one corner of that triangle created stress at the other two. The manufacturers who supplied the northern logging industry were concentrated in a corridor of industrial production stretching from Lima, Ohio, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Companies including the Climax Manufacturing Company of Corry, Pennsylvania, the Shay Locomotive Works operating under licensing agreements with the Lima Machine Works, and several smaller regional foundries produced machines specifically adapted for the timber harvesting environment. The Shay locomotive, designed by Ephraim Shay, a Michigan logger who had grown frustrated with the inadequacy of conventional locomotive designs on temporary forest rail lines, became the dominant machine type in the northern logging frontier by the 1880s. The Shay was a masterpiece of practical adaptation. Its three-cylinder vertical engine, mounted on the right side of the boiler and driving all axles through a flexible shaft and bevel gear system, gave it exceptional tractive effort at low speeds on steep grades and poorly laid temporary track. A standard Shay could negotiate curves of 60 feet radius and grades of 7% performance that would have destroyed a conventional rod locomotive within hours. Its boiler was horizontal, fed by a firebox designed to burn the green cordwood and waste timber that the logging operations produced in unlimited quantity. Between 1880 and 1900, more than 2,000 Shay locomotives were built and deployed across the northern logging frontier, in addition to hundreds of Climax and Heisler machines of similar design philosophy. They pushed into the forest on temporary spur lines that were laid ahead of the harvest and torn up behind it, advancing the logging frontier at a rate that the river driving era had never approached. By 1890, a single well-equipped logging operation in the Wisconsin Northwoods could move 300,000 board feet of timber per day from stump to railhead. 10 years earlier, the same operation using animal teams and river drives might have moved 30,000. The boiler engine had multiplied productive capacity tenfold in a single decade. That productivity had a denominator that did not appear in the company ledgers. It was measured in pressure, in heat, in the accumulated fatigue of iron that was asked to perform beyond the conditions its specifications had anticipated. And it was measured with a regularity that the industry preferred not to discuss publicly in the bodies of the men who stood closest to the fire. The machine had arrived. The frontier was open. The timber was falling. And somewhere on a frozen spur line in the pre-dawn darkness, a fireman was watching a pressure gauge climb toward a number that made experienced men go quiet. To understand how a boiler kills, you must first understand what a boiler is. Not in the simplified language of industrial promotion. Not in the optimistic diagrams that manufacturers distributed to prospective buyers showing clean cross-sections and neatly labeled components rendered in precise lithographic ink. You must understand it as the firemen understood it, as a vessel of contained thermal violence, a metal boundary between controlled energy and catastrophic release, maintained in its function not by any inherent stability, but by the continuous, imperfect labor of human attention. A locomotive boiler of the type deployed across the northern logging frontier in the 1880s and 1890s consisted of several interdependent systems, each one dependent on the integrity of the others, each one capable, under specific conditions of failure, of initiating a cascade that the iron shell could not contain. The firebox was the origin point of everything. It was a rectangular chamber of iron plate, typically measuring 4 feet in width, 5 feet in length, and 6 feet in height in a standard Shay or climax locomotive of the period. Its walls were double, an inner sheet of iron exposed directly to the combustion chamber and an outer sheet separated from the inner by a water space of 3 to 4 inches. That water space was the fundamental principle of the entire system. Water absorbs heat with extraordinary efficiency. As long as the water space remained full, as long as water maintained contact with every inch of the inner firebox sheet, the iron would not overheat. The temperature of the metal would remain within tolerances that the riveted seams and plate thicknesses were designed to sustain. The crown sheet was the most critical surface in this entire assembly. It was the horizontal iron plate that formed the top of the firebox, the ceiling of the combustion chamber, the floor of the water space above it. It was the closest point in the entire boiler to the direct heat of the fire. It was, consequently, the first surface to fail when the water level dropped below safe operating height. When the crown sheet lost water contact, its temperature rose within minutes from the 300 degrees of normal operation to temperatures exceeding 800, then 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, wrought iron loses between 40 and 60% of its tensile strength. The riveted seams that held the crown sheet in place, seams that had been specified and driven at room temperature, tested at operational pressure, and expected to perform at 300 degrees, were suddenly being asked to hold against the full boiler pressure at temperatures that reduced their effective strength to a fraction of their rated capacity. They could not. The failure mode was not gradual. It was not a slow leak that gave warning. When a crown sheet failed under these conditions, it failed completely and instantaneously. The entire water volume of the boiler, which in a standard Shay locomotive of the 1880s amounted to between 800 and 1,200 gallons, was suddenly exposed to a firebox temperature sufficient to flash it entirely to steam in a fraction of a second. The physics of this event are precise, and they are terrible. 1 gallon of water, converted entirely to steam at atmospheric pressure, expands to a volume of approximately 1,700 cubic feet. In the confined space of a boiler shell operating at 140 pounds per square inch, that expansion has nowhere to go except outward, through whatever structural weakness the explosion finds first. In the microseconds between crown sheet failure and full boiler rupture, the pressure inside the shell climbs to multiples of its operating specification. The iron plate of the boiler shell, already heated and stressed by continuous operation, receives that pressure spike without warning and without preparation. The result is not an explosion in the conventional sense. It is a detonation. The boiler shell does not crack or split. It disintegrates, fragmenting into projectile sections of iron plate weighing between 20 and 300 pounds, accelerated outward at velocities comparable to artillery fragmentation. Sections of boiler shell have been recovered from logging boiler explosions at distances of 400 feet from the point of rupture. A firebox door, weighing 60 pounds, was found embedded 3 inches into a living white pine at a distance of 230 feet, following one documented Wisconsin explosion of 1893. But the iron fragments were not the primary cause of death for the men standing nearest the machine. Steam was. The superheated steam released in a boiler explosion at 140 pounds per square inch carries a thermal energy density that exceeds the capacity of any contemporary description to fully convey. It does not burn in the way that open flame burns. It does not require contact in the way that hot metal requires contact. It permeates. It penetrates clothing, penetrates the boundary layer of cooler air that normally insulates exposed skin, and transfers its thermal energy into human tissue with a completeness and speed that leaves no intermediate stage between intact and destroyed. A man standing within 15 feet of a boiler explosion of this type received, in the first second, a thermal dose sufficient to cause full-thickness burns across every exposed surface of his body and through clothing of standard weight. The fireman, who stood by the nature of his work within 3 to 8 feet of the firebox door at the moment of crown sheet failure, received the full discharge at near maximum thermal intensity. The logging industry understood this mechanism, not in the precise thermodynamic language deployed here, but in the empirical language of men who had seen what boiler explosions did to human bodies and had continued nonetheless to operate the machines under conditions that made those explosions predictable rather than exceptional. They understood it because the warning signs were visible, measurable, and documented. The pressure gauge, properly functioning, showed the dangerous climb. The water glass, a vertical glass tube mounted on the boiler face that displayed the water level inside the shell, showed the dangerous drop. The behavior of the safety valve, the sound of the steam release, the color of the exhaust from the stack, all of these were legible indicators to an experienced operator that the system was approaching a condition of instability. The problem was not that the instruments were absent. The problem was the conditions under which they were being read. A fireman on a northern logging locomotive in February, working a 12 to 16-hour shift, stoking a firebox that consumed a cord of wood every 2 hours, operating in ambient temperatures of 10 to 20 degrees below zero that fogged every glass surface and stiffened every valve stem. That man was reading instruments under conditions that transformed reliable information into ambiguous noise. The water glass frosted on its exterior. The pressure gauge needle vibrated from the engine's own movement. The safety valve, if it had been allowed to accumulate mineral deposits from the hard water common to northern Wisconsin and Michigan, might not release at its specified pressure. And the company's instruction to the firemen, explicit, documented in the operational records of multiple logging concerns, was to keep the steam up and keep the logs moving. The machine was not out of control. It was under a very specific kind of control, the control of production schedules and board-foot quotas, exercised by men who were never within 1,000 feet of the firebox door. The boiler inspector arrived at the logging camp on a Tuesday in late October. He came by supply wagon from the nearest railhead, 41 miles south, carrying a canvas bag of tools and a ledger book with pre-printed inspection forms. He had 14 camps to visit before the winter operating season began in earnest, and he had 9 days to complete the circuit. He was not an incompetent man. He had worked as a boilermaker's apprentice for 3 years before taking the inspector's position with the State Labor Bureau. He knew what a properly riveted seam looked like. He knew how to read a pressure gauge and test a safety valve. What he could not do, in the time available to him, was find what was already hidden inside the iron. The structural dangers that made logging boilers so catastrophically unpredictable were not, in most cases, visible on the exterior surface of the machine. They accumulated invisibly. in the internal geography of the boiler shell, in the spaces between the inner and outer firebox sheets, in the sediment that built up on the crown sheet's upper surface where the water space was narrowest and the heat was greatest. Scale was the primary killer. Not the dramatic, sudden failure of overtaxed iron, but the slow, patient accumulation of mineral deposits on the interior surfaces of the boiler, calcium carbonate, magnesium silicate, iron oxide, precipitated out of the hard water that the northern logging operations drew from streams, lakes, and seasonal meltwater sources of highly variable mineral content. Scale is an insulator. A layer of calcium carbonate 1/8 of an inch thick on the crown sheet surface reduces the rate of heat transfer from iron to water by approximately 40%. A quarter-inch layer reduces it by nearly 70%. The iron beneath that scale can no longer dissipate its absorbed heat into the water above it. Its temperature climbs. Its strength diminishes. The riveted seams at its edges, already stressed by the thermal cycling of daily operation, the expansion and contraction of metal moving between cold shutdown temperatures and full operating heat, repeated hundreds of times across a single logging season, begin to weep, to open fractionally. 2.
Admit tiny quantities of mineral-laden water that flash immediately to steam and deposit their own microscopic layers of scale before the seam closes again under pressure. This process was well understood by 1880. The remedies were equally well understood. Regular boiler washing, draining the shell completely, flushing the water spaces with clean water, physically removing scale deposits, with purpose-made scrapers introduced through washout plugs in the boiler shell, could interrupt the accumulation cycle and restore safe heat transfer rates.
Chemical treatment of feed water, using lime or soda ash to precipitate minerals before they entered the boiler, could slow the process significantly. The northern logging industry performed these procedures with a frequency that was determined not by engineering necessity, but by production schedules. A boiler washing required the machine to be taken out of service for a minimum of 12 hours, the time needed to cool the shell sufficiently for safe entry, complete the washing and inspection, and return to operating pressure. During the peak of the winter logging season, when frozen ground conditions provided the ideal surface for moving log sleds and the pressure of quarterly timber contracts was at its maximum, 12 hours of downtime on a single locomotive represented a production loss that camp superintendents were deeply reluctant to absorb. The documentary record of multiple Wisconsin and Michigan logging operations from this period shows washout intervals ranging from the manufacturer recommended 21 days to actual practice intervals of 60, 90, and in documented cases, 140 days between boiler washings. The scale that accumulated in those extended intervals was not a theoretical danger. It was a measured one. Boiler inspectors who examined machines following explosions, in the cases where sufficient structural evidence survived for meaningful post-mortem analysis, consistently found crown sheet scale deposits of between 3/8 and 5/8 of an inch. At those thicknesses, the crown sheet was operating at internal temperatures that exceeded the safe working limit of its iron composition by margins of 200 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. The machine was failing long before it exploded. It was failing in millimeter increments, in microscopic crystalline deposits, in the infinitesimal widening of rivet holes under repeated thermal stress. The explosion was not an event. It was a conclusion, the final statement of a process that had been writing itself across months of deferred maintenance and overextended operation. There was a second hidden danger, less discussed in the technical literature, but equally lethal in the operational context of the northern logging frontier. It was the problem of repair. When a boiler component failed in a way that was visible and immediate, a cracked steam pipe, a leaking valve, a broken gauge glass, the logging camp had two options. It could take the machine out of service and wait for a qualified boilermaker to make the journey from the nearest town, which might require 3 to 7 days. Or it could effect a field repair using whatever materials and skills were available in the camp. The field repairs documented in the operational records of northern logging companies during this period represent a catalog of improvisational engineering that would have horrified the machine's designers. Rivet holes enlarged by corrosion were filled with wooden plugs coated in white lead paste, a technique that held at low pressures and failed catastrophically at high ones. Cracked crown sheets were reinforced with iron straps bolted across the fracture, a repair that transferred stress to the bolt holes and created new failure points under thermal cycling. Steam pipe joints that leaked were wrapped in asbestos rope and wire, a repair that concealed the leak without addressing the underlying deterioration of the pipe wall. These repairs were not performed by ignorant men acting in bad faith. They were performed by practical men operating under genuine constraints of time, distance, and resource availability, doing what they could with what they had. Because the alternative, shutting down the machine and losing production, was not a choice that the economic structure of the logging operation made available to them in any meaningful sense. The hidden flaw in the logging boiler engine was not purely metallurgical. It was not simply a matter of scale deposits and deferred maintenance schedules. It was systemic. It was the product of an industrial organization that placed the burden of managing irreconcilable pressures, production pressure and steam pressure, economic pressure and structural pressure, on the man standing closest to the fire, who had the least power to resolve them and paid the highest price when they could no longer be reconciled. The inspector closed his ledger, noted the machine as serviceable with minor observations, and climbed back onto the supply wagon. He had 12 more camps to visit in 8 days. Behind him, the boiler resumed its work. The needle climbed. The scale continued its patient accumulation in the darkness inside the iron. And the forest waited, indifferent, for what the machine would do next. The logging camp existed in a condition of perpetual, organized exhaustion. It was not chaos. That is the first thing to understand about the operational rhythm of a northern logging camp at the height of the timber era. The men who built and ran these operations were not reckless or disorganized. They were efficient, in the brutal and specific way that extraction industries produce efficiency, by compressing every available hour of every available day into productive labor, by eliminating every margin of rest and recovery that could not be defended as operationally necessary, by building a social and economic structure that made leaving more costly than staying, and staying more costly than working. The camp occupied a cleared area of perhaps 3 acres at the end of the most recently extended spur line, surrounded on every side by the timber it existed to consume. The bunkhouse was a low structure of unpeeled logs, chinked with moss and clay, heated by a central iron stove that burned continuously from October through April. 40 to 60 men slept in it on wooden bunks arranged in double tiers, their wool clothing hanging from rafters above them, the air dense with the smell of wet wool, pine pitch, tobacco smoke, and the particular human odor of men who bathed infrequently in conditions that made bathing a logistical challenge rather than a personal choice. They rose at 4:30 in the morning. Not because a clock told them to. Clocks were rare in the camps and largely irrelevant to an operation governed by the hours of usable daylight and the operational demands of the locomotive. They rose because the cook began work at 4, and the smell of salt pork frying in a cast-iron pan the size of a wagon wheel was a more effective alarm than any mechanical device. Breakfast was substantial and deliberate. 3,000 calories of salt pork, dried beans, sourdough bread, boiled potatoes, and black coffee served in tin mugs without ceremony or comfort. The men ate in silence or near silence. Conversation was a luxury of the evening hours, when the body had been returned to the bunkhouse and the day's work could not be further extended. The fireman's day began before anyone else's. He was responsible for raising steam, for bringing the boiler from its overnight banked condition to full operating pressure before the first log train needed to move. This required arriving at the locomotive in darkness, in temperatures that in January and February regularly reached 20 and 30 degrees below zero, and beginning the process of feeding the firebox with the pre-split cordwood that had been stacked beside the track the previous evening. Raising steam from a banked fire to 140 pounds per square inch required approximately 90 minutes of continuous stoking. 90 minutes of opening and closing the firebox door in weather cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 4 minutes, of feeding wood into a fire. That demanded a new load every 8 to 12 minutes, of watching the pressure gauge in the pre-dawn darkness by the light of a single lantern whose glass fogged continuously in the temperature differential between the fire's heat and the surrounding air. His tools were a shovel, a poker, a set of firing tongs, and his own judgment. The judgment was the most important instrument and the most variable. An experienced fireman, a man who had spent 2 or 3 seasons on the same or similar machines, developed an intuitive reading of his boiler's behavior that went beyond the instruments. He heard the difference between normal steam circulation sounds and the subtle change in tone that indicated a partially blocked water tube. He felt the difference in the firebox door's resistance when the draft was drawing correctly versus when a collapsed ash bed was restricting airflow. He noticed, without consciously articulating it, the pattern of moisture on the exterior boiler shell that indicated where internal scale was concentrating heat. This knowledge was entirely personal, entirely unwritten, and entirely non-transferable. When a fireman left a machine, through injury, illness, the end of a seasonal contract, or death, his accumulated knowledge of that specific boiler's idiosyncrasies left with him. His replacement arrived with whatever general experience he possessed and began the process of learning the machine from the beginning, during which period the risk of misreading a warning sign was at its highest. The timber companies understood this dynamic and its implications. The operational records are explicit. Turnover among firemen was high, higher than among any other skilled category of logging camp labor. And the companies responded to it not by improving conditions or compensation to retain experienced men, but by reducing the skill threshold required for hiring. By the late 1880s, logging operations across the northern frontier were routinely placing men with 2 to 4 weeks of firing experience on machines that demanded 2 to 3 years of experience to operate safely. The wage that justified this risk was between $1 and $1.30 per day. Room and board were deducted from this at a rate of 20 to 25 cents daily, leaving a net earning of between 75 cents and $1.05 for a 12 to 16-hour day of work that placed the earner in continuous proximity to a machine capable of killing him without warning. The men accepted these terms because the alternatives available to them in the economic landscape of the 1880s and 1890s were not substantially better, and because the specific geography of the logging frontier, remote, isolated, accessible only by the company's own transportation infrastructure, made the act of leaving a more complicated proposition than it appeared on paper. A man who decided at the end of February that the conditions were unacceptable was 40 miles from the nearest town, in weather that made that distance a genuine physical challenge, with wages that might or might not have been fully paid depending on the camp's accounting practices. He was not precisely a prisoner, but he was not precisely free either. In the evenings, after the locomotive had been banked and the day's production numbers tallied by the camp scaler, the men gathered in the bunkhouse in a companionship born of shared physical extremity. They played cards with a deck so worn that individual cards were identifiable by their damage rather than their markings. They told stories, logging stories, railroad stories, stories of boiler explosions they had witnessed or survived or heard described by men who had stood close enough to feel the pressure wave. These stories were not told as cautionary tales. They were told as credentials, as evidence of proximity to industrial danger that conferred a specific kind of status among men who measured courage in practical rather than rhetorical terms. They knew the machine could kill them. They knew it with the same matter-of-fact clarity with which they knew the cold could kill them, and the falling timber could kill them, and the log jams on the spring drives could kill them. The northern logging frontier was an environment in which death was a regular presence, distributed across multiple mechanisms, and the men who worked it had made a specific psychological accommodation to that fact, not resignation, not fatalism, but a practical calibration of attention that kept the known dangers visible without allowing them to become paralyzing. The fireman banked his fire. He checked the water glass one final time. He noted the pressure reading in the informal mental ledger that served, in the absence of any formal log requirement, as the record of his machine's condition. He walked back to the bunkhouse through the frozen dark, past the white pine stands that stood silent and enormous in the winter starlight, and he lay down on his bunk and slept the immediate, total sleep of a man who has spent 12 hours feeding a contained explosion. In 6 hours, he would do it again. The explosion at the Penokee spur came on the 14th of January, 1893. The date is recoverable from the operational records of the Drummond Timber Company, filed with the Ashland County Clerk in the spring of that year as part of a liability inquiry that ultimately produced no legal consequence for anyone. The records are dry and administrative in their language. They described the event as a boiler incident resulting in the loss of 2 employees and damage to rolling stock valued at approximately $900. The rolling stock received 3 lines of documentation. The 2 employees received 1 line each. What the records do not describe is the morning. It had been the coldest January in the Penokee highlands in 11 years. The temperature at the camp thermometer on the morning of the 14th read -28 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 o'clock. The locomotive, a 12-ton Shay built by the Lima Machine Works in 1889, 4 years old and operating on its original crown sheet without documented replacement, had been in continuous service for 63 days since its last boiler washing. The water source for the camp that winter was a creek 200 yards from the spur line, accessed through a hole chopped daily in ice that had reached a thickness of 31 inches by mid-January. The water drawn from beneath that ice was heavily mineralized, a fact noted by the camp cook, who complained of its effect on the taste of the coffee and by no one else. The fireman that morning was a man named Arvid Lunden. He was 26 years old, Swedish-born, and had come to the Penokee camp 6 weeks earlier following the end of a threshing season in central Wisconsin. He had 4 weeks of firing experience on a stationary agricultural boiler. He had never fired a locomotive boiler before arriving at the Drummond camp. He had been hired nonetheless, because the previous fireman had left the camp 3 days after London's arrival, walking out in the pre-dawn hours without collecting his final week's wages, a detail that appears in the payroll records without explanation and without apparent concern from the camp. Superintendent. London raised steam that morning without incident. The pressure gauge climbed through its normal arc. He noted nothing unusual, because he did not yet possess the accumulated experiential knowledge that would have allowed him to recognize what unusual looked like on this specific machine. The water glass read at its normal operational level. The safety valve was set, or was believed to be set, at 150 pounds per square inch. What London could not see was the crown sheet above the firebox. 63 days of uninterrupted operation on mineralized water had deposited a scale layer of approximately 7/16 of an inch across the upper surface of the crown sheet. At the point directly above the hottest section of the firebox, the back corner nearest the flue sheet, where combustion gases concentrated before entering the boiler tubes, the scale deposit reached 9/16 of an inch. Beneath that scale, the iron of the crown sheet had been operating at an effective temperature of between 700 and 850 degrees Fahrenheit for an indeterminate number of operational hours. The rivets securing the crown sheet's rear edge to the firebox wrapper sheet had experienced thermal expansion and contraction cycles sufficient to enlarge their holes by measurable fractions and reduce their clamping force by an estimated 30%. The first log train of the morning was loaded and coupled by 7:15. The locomotive moved out onto the main spur under normal conditions. The load was 64 tons of white pine logs on 4 flat cars, a standard train for the Drummond operation. The grade on the outbound run was 3% descending, which placed the boiler in a nose-down attitude that reduced the effective water coverage of the crown sheet by a calculable margin. This was a known characteristic of locomotive boiler operation on grades. Experienced firemen compensated for it by maintaining a slightly higher water level before beginning a downgrade run. Lunden maintained the water level he had been maintaining throughout the morning, which was the correct level for level track and insufficient for a 3% descending grade. By 7:41, the crown sheet above the rear firebox corner was no longer in contact with water. The temperature curve from that point forward was not gradual. It was a vertical line on any graph that attempted to represent it. The iron moved through the upper range of its safe operating temperature and beyond it in under 4 minutes. The scale that had been insulating it and that had been contributing to its dangerous temperature condition for 63 days now served an additional function. It held the failing iron in apparent structural continuity for approximately 90 seconds longer than an unscaled crown sheet would have held, concealing the imminence of failure behind a mineral mask until the moment when nothing could conceal it any longer. At 7:43 in the morning, the rear riveted seam of the crown sheet separated. The sequence of events that followed occupied approximately 1.4 seconds from initial crown sheet failure to complete boiler shell rupture. In that 1.4 seconds, the following occurred. The water space above the exposed crown sheet flashed instantaneously to steam. The internal pressure of the boiler shell rose from 142 pounds per square inch to a value that exceeded the burst pressure of the shell by a factor that post-incident analysis estimated at between 3 and 4. The boiler shell fragmented along 3 principal lines of weakness: the left side longitudinal seam, the front tube sheet, and a transverse line across the upper third of the shell, producing major fragments including a section of the upper shell measuring 6 feet by 3 feet and weighing approximately 340 pounds, which was projected forward and upward at an angle of 32 degrees from horizontal. Arvid Lunden was standing on the left running board adjacent to the firebox door at the moment of rupture. The steam discharge reached him before the iron fragments did. He was found by the men who reached the site 11 minutes after the explosion at a distance of 22 feet from the locomotive's final position. He was alive. He remained alive for 4 hours and 17 minutes in the care of the camp cook, the only man present with any medical knowledge, who could do nothing of substance for injuries of that severity beyond providing what comfort the situation permitted. The second fatality was the brakeman, a man named Olof Strand, 31 years old, who had been riding the rear platform of the last log car. A section of boiler shell casing struck the rear car at an angle sufficient to derail it, and Strand was thrown from the platform into the path of the derailing logs. His death was instantaneous. The locomotive's engineer, who had been leaning out of the cab on the right side at the moment of explosion, shielded from the primary steam discharge by the boiler body itself, survived with burns to his right arm and partial hearing loss that persisted for the remainder of his life. He provided a written statement to the county inquiry 9 days after the explosion. His statement described the sequence of events with a precision and composure that suggests either remarkable psychological resilience or a prior understanding that composure was what the situation required of him. The inquiry convened on the 3rd of February and concluded on the 7th. It heard testimony from the camp superintendent, the engineer, 2 laborers who had witnessed the explosion from a distance, and the boiler inspector who had examined the locomotive in October. The inspector testified that the machine had appeared serviceable at the time of his examination. The camp superintendent testified that operational procedures had been followed. The inquiry concluded that the explosion was the result of insufficient water in the boiler due to operator error. Arvid Lunden, being dead, could not testify to what the water glass had read at 7:43 in the morning of January 14th. Olof Strand, being dead, could not testify to anything. The inquiry's findings were filed with the county clerk. The Drummond Timber Company paid no fine. The damaged rolling stock was assessed for insurance purposes. A replacement locomotive was ordered from the Lima Machine Works in February and arrived at the camp on a flat car in early April, in time for the spring operating season. The forest continued to fall. 40 miles north of the Penokee Spur, in the uncut timber stands of the Gogebic Range, the white pine waited in its millions of board feet. It did not wait long. Within 2 years, the spur lines had reached it. The boilers were running again, feeding on cordwood and mineralized water, pushing their needles toward the red marks on their gauges, maintained by men whose names appeared in payroll records and disappeared from them without ceremony. The machine had spoken in its loudest possible register. The industry had heard it, assessed it, assigned it a dollar value, and moved on. In the 30 years between 1870 and 1900, the United States government conducted no comprehensive national census of industrial boiler explosions. This was not an oversight born of ignorance. The technical knowledge required to design and implement such a census existed. The administrative infrastructure of the federal government was entirely capable of collecting and organizing the relevant data. The decision not to collect it was a policy position, arrived at through the accumulated weight of industrial lobbying, jurisdictional ambiguity between federal and state authority, and the foundational political conviction of the Gilded Age that the regulatory apparatus of government had no legitimate business inserting itself between a private enterprise and the operational decisions it made on its own property. The consequence of this position was that the true scale of boiler-related mortality in the American logging industry during this period cannot be stated with precision. It can only be estimated from state-level records of variable completeness, from insurance company actuarial data, from the incident reports filed by logging companies with county clerks and state labor bureaus when local statute required them to do so, and from the systematic gaps in those records that themselves constitute a form of evidence. What the available data suggests is this. Between 1880 and 1905, boiler explosions in the northern logging industry of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota killed a minimum of 312 men for whom documentary evidence of identity and circumstance survives. The actual mortality figure, accounting for incidents in which no report was filed, in which the dead were transient workers with no local record, or in which the explosion was classified as an accident of another type, is estimated by the most careful historical analyses at between 800 and 1,100 deaths across the same period and geography. In addition to fatalities, non-fatal injuries from boiler explosions and steam-related incidents, scaldings, burns, blast injuries, hearing damage, and the long-term pulmonary consequences of steam inhalation affected a working population whose total size in the northern logging industry peaked at approximately 170,000 men in 1890. The injury rate for steam-related incidents in this workforce, calculated from the partial records available, suggests that a logging worker employed in proximity to a steam locomotive had a 1 in 47 chance of sustaining a significant steam injury over the course of a single operating season. These numbers accumulated without producing the legislative response that comparable mortality in a more visible industrial context would have generated. The reasons were structural, and they were self-reinforcing. The northern logging frontier was geographically remote, which meant that boiler explosions occurred without witnesses beyond the immediate workforce. It was economically powerful, which meant that the timber industry possessed both the financial resources and the political relationships necessary to influence the regulatory environment at the state level. It was temporally compressed, the entire industrial cycle of the northern timber era, from initial penetration of the frontier to effective exhaustion of commercially viable timber, occupied roughly 35 years, which meant that by the time regulatory pressure accumulated to the point of legislative action, the industry was already in structural decline, and the most dangerous phase of its operation was concluding. Wisconsin passed its first meaningful boiler inspection statute in 1887, 17 years after the industrial-scale deployment of logging locomotives had begun in the state. The statute required annual inspection of stationary boilers and boilers on vessels operating on Wisconsin waterways. It did not explicitly cover portable locomotive boilers operating on private logging railroads on private land, an exemption that the logging industry had lobbied for specifically and obtained without significant public opposition. Michigan's boiler inspection framework, similarly structured, contained analogous exemptions. Minnesota's statutory provisions were even more permissive. The men who lobbied for these exemptions were not anonymous. Their names appear in the legislative records of 3 state capitals. They wrote letters to committee chairmen on company stationery. They argued, with a consistency that suggests coordination, that the imposition of mandatory inspection requirements on logging locomotive boilers would impose costs that the industry could not absorb, would introduce delays into operational schedules that would damage the competitive position of domestic timber production, and would represent an unconstitutional intrusion into the private management of private property. All 3 arguments were made sincerely. All 3 arguments were accepted, repeatedly, by legislative bodies that were not indifferent to the mortality of logging workers, but were more immediately responsive to the economic power of the timber industry and the political calculus of constituencies in which the timber companies were the dominant employers. The workers themselves were not entirely without organized response to these conditions. The late 1880s and 1890s saw the emergence of labor organizing activity in the northern logging camps, driven in part by the specific grievances of dangerous working conditions and in part by the broader currents of the American labor movement that were generating the Knights of Labor, the early American Federation of Labor, and a network of industrial unionism that would eventually consolidate into the industrial workers of the world. The logging industry was a difficult environment for union organizing. The workforce was seasonal and highly mobile. The camps were remote and physically isolated from urban labor networks. The companies controlled the transportation infrastructure that connected workers to the outside world. And the practice of blacklisting known union organizers was systematic and effective. Strikes did occur. In the Saginaw Valley of Michigan in 1885, a strike involving approximately 3,000 sawmill and logging workers over the question of a 10-hour working day achieved partial success after 2 weeks of work stoppage. In Wisconsin's Chippewa Valley in 1881, a smaller action focused specifically on camp conditions, including the question of boiler maintenance standards and the right of workers to refuse operation of machines they considered unsafe, was broken within 4 days when the company imported replacement workers from Chicago, and successfully prosecuted 3 strike leaders under a criminal conspiracy statute. The Chippewa Valley Action of 1881 is particularly significant because it represents one of the earliest documented instances of American industrial workers asserting a formal collective claim to the right of refusal on safety grounds. The workers involved were not labor theorists. They were practical men who had watched colleagues die in boiler explosions and had reached the conclusion that the production schedule did not constitute a sufficient justification for the risk. Their claim was dismissed by the courts, their leaders were imprisoned for 30- and 60-day terms, and the specific demand for worker safety oversight of boiler maintenance was denied entirely. The broader systemic consequence of the northern logging boiler era extended beyond the immediate question of worker mortality. It established patterns of industrial risk management, or more precisely, risk externalization, that became templates for subsequent extractive industries operating in remote or poorly regulated environments. The practice of deploying capital equipment beyond its safe operational parameters, of substituting unskilled for skilled labor in safety-critical roles as a cost management strategy, of influencing regulatory frameworks to exclude the most dangerous operational contexts from oversight, requirements, and of classifying worker deaths as individual operational failures rather than systemic design choices. All of these practices were refined and institutionalized during the northern logging era. They did not end with it. The timber companies that had pioneered these practices in the Wisconsin Northwoods carried their operational culture southward into the Gulf Coast longleaf pine forests of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas in the 1890s and 1900s, and westward into the Douglas fir stands of the Pacific Northwest. The same machines, the same maintenance practices, the same labor management strategies, the same regulatory exemptions pursued through the same legislative channels. The geography changed. The timber species changed. The mortality continued. By 1910, the white pine forests of the northern Great Lakes states were effectively exhausted. The industry had consumed, in approximately 3.5 decades of industrial-scale harvesting, a timber resource that had required between 500 and 8,000 years to grow, depending on the stand. The logged-over lands, cut over in the terminology of the era, were left in a condition that the industry characterized as prepared for agricultural settlement, and that the settlers who attempted to farm them characterized rather differently. The stumps remained in the ground for decades. The slash, the branches and tops and bark left behind by the harvest covered the ground in layers sufficient to fuel the catastrophic fires that swept through the cutover regions repeatedly in the 1890s and 1900s, burning towns and killing hundreds of people in events that the boiler explosions of the logging era, for all their accumulated mortality, could not match in single-incident scale. The machine had done what it was built to do. It had cleared the northern logging frontier with an efficiency that would have been unimaginable to the axemen who first entered those forests. The forests were gone. The machine moved on. There is a place in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, where the second growth forest has reclaimed what the logging era took. It does not look, to the casual eye, like a wound. The birch and aspen that colonized the cutover ground in the decades after the white pine was gone have grown to respectable heights. The undergrowth is dense and various. In summer, the canopy closes overhead, and the light filters through in the particular green-gold way that northern forests produce, and a person walking through it could be forgiven for believing that this landscape has always been what it now appears, a functioning, intact northern woodland, ancient and undisturbed. The stumps will correct that impression. They are still there, beneath the second growth, in their thousands. White pine stumps, 4 and 5 feet in diameter at their cut surfaces, their tops gone flat and gray with a century of weathering, their root systems still locked into the soil with a permanence that outlasted the industry that created them and will outlast the second-growth forest that surrounds them. The wood of a white pine stump resists decay with extraordinary stubbornness. Some of these stumps are more than 130 years old and still structurally intact, their resinous grain sealed against the organisms that would otherwise have returned them to the soil decades ago. They stand, or rather they persist at ground level, as the most durable artifacts of an industrial episode whose other physical evidence has largely vanished. The locomotives are gone. The spur-line rails were pulled up as the operations retreated, reused on the next frontier, worn to scrap on the one after that. The camp buildings rotted into the ground within a generation of abandonment. The company offices in Eau Claire and Muskegon and Saginaw were repurposed, demolished, or simply allowed to decline as the enterprises they housed contracted and dissolved. The men who operated the machines are gone. Their children are gone, in most cases. Their grandchildren, in the counties where the logging era built what towns exist, are aging. What remains beyond the stumps is the shape of the land itself. The northern logging frontier was not simply harvested, it was restructured. The temporary rail lines that penetrated the forest altered drainage patterns that have not fully recovered. The removal of the forest canopy changed the hydrology of watersheds across millions of acres in ways that are still measurable in the flow rates of rivers and the water tables of agricultural land that was never successfully farmed. The slash fires that followed the harvest deposited ash layers across the cut-over ground that altered soil chemistry for generations. The species composition of the second-growth forest that eventually reclaimed the cut-over land is fundamentally different from the white pine forest that preceded it, less productive, less structurally complex, supporting a different and diminished range of wildlife. These consequences were not unknown in their time. Government surveyors and early conservationists documented them as they unfolded, in reports that reached congressional committees and state legislatures and accomplished, in the years when they might have produced meaningful protective intervention, very little. The most prescient of these voices, men like Carl Schurz, who as Secretary of the Interior in the late 1870s, argued for federal forest reserves with a clarity and urgency that the political climate of his era could not accommodate, were heard, noted, filed, and substantially disregarded. The conservation movement that eventually produced the Federal Forest Reserve System, the National Forest Service under Gifford Pinchot, and the broader framework of American public land management was not created by the logging industry's critics in isolation. It was created in significant part by the visible evidence of what an unregulated extractive industry did to a landscape when given access without constraint. The cutover regions of Wisconsin and Michigan were among the most powerful arguments that conservationists possessed in the debates of the 1890s and 1900s. Not abstract arguments about the value of forests or the ethics of extraction, but concrete, visible, photographable evidence of an industrial process that had consumed a major regional ecosystem within a single human lifetime. The boiler engine was at the center of that transformation. Without the logging locomotive, the northern timber frontier would have retreated more slowly, following the river systems and the natural constraints of animal-powered transport. The most remote and elevated timber stands, the ones that the Shay and Climax locomotives were specifically designed to reach, would have remained commercially inaccessible for decades longer, possibly long enough for the emerging conservation framework to establish protective designations. Before the industry arrived, the speed of the harvest which the boiler engine made possible was precisely what overwhelmed the nascent regulatory and conservation response. This is the machine's largest legacy, and it is a landscape one. It is written in the absence of trees that should still be standing, in the altered courses of rivers whose watersheds were stripped of their natural water retention, in the soil profiles of land that was logged, burned, farmed unsuccessfully, and ultimately abandoned to a second growth succession. That will require centuries more to approach the structural complexity of what was removed. The human legacy is written in different registers. The safety reform movement that the boiler explosion mortality of the logging era helped generate, along with the far more publicly visible disasters of riverboat and stationary boiler explosions in urban and transportation contexts, eventually produced the regulatory frameworks that govern pressure vessel operation in the United States to this day. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers began developing its Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code in 1911, a standardization effort that established minimum design, fabrication, and inspection requirements for steam pressure vessels across American industry. The code's development was not driven by abstract engineering principle alone. It was driven by a death toll that had become, by the first decade of the 20th century, politically unsustainable even in the context of an industrial culture that had absorbed extraordinary levels of worker mortality without legislative response. The logging industry's specific contribution to that death toll was never formally aggregated or publicly acknowledged in the way that the great riverboat disasters, the Sultana in 1865, the Princess in 1904, generated public outrage and legislative pressure. The logging boiler deaths occurred one and two at a time in remote locations among men whose names appeared in no urban newspaper, whose families in many cases never received formal notification of their deaths, whose graves, where marked at all, occupy the corners of county cemeteries in Ashland and Iron and Sawyer counties, in towns that the logging era built and the logging era's end nearly destroyed. Some of those graves carry no name. The records did not always preserve them. There is a particular kind of historical injustice in invisibility, in the condition of having your labor recorded in board feet and your death recorded as a line item, of having built an industry whose products framed the buildings of every expanding American city while your own name faded from the documentary record within a generation of your death. The men who fired the logging boilers of the northern frontier did not choose obscurity. They chose wages, the only meaningful choice available to them in the economic structure of their time and place, and the obscurity was imposed on them by the same structure that set the wages. To examine this history honestly is to hold two things simultaneously in view. The first is the genuine magnitude of what the boiler engine accomplished. The northern logging frontier produced, at its peak in the early 1890s, more than 8 billion board feet of lumber per year from the three-state region of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. That lumber built the houses, the commercial buildings, the farm structures, and the infrastructure of a rapidly urbanizing nation. It was real material production of real economic value, and the lives it supported and the cities it helped construct are not diminished in their reality by the manner of the timber's extraction. The second is the equally genuine magnitude of what was consumed to accomplish it, not only the forests but the men who operated the machines that harvested them. 3 decades of industrial mortality absorbed in near-total public silence by a workforce that had no effective means of collective refusal, operating machinery that its employers knew to be dangerous under conditions that its designers had never anticipated, for wages that did not begin to compensate for the risk. These two things cannot be separated. The board feet and the bodies are part of the same accounting, and any history of the northern logging frontier that presents one without the other is not a history, it is a ledger with missing columns. The boiler engine that cleared the northern logging frontier was not a villain in any simple narrative sense. It was a tool, extraordinarily powerful, imperfectly understood, ruthlessly deployed. Its fire was real. The steam it generated was real. The logs it moved were real. The men it killed were real. Their names are recoverable, some of them in the county records and the company ledgers and the church registries of small northern towns. Arvid Lunden, Olaf Strand, dozens of others whose first names and last names and ages and origins are preserved in documents that few people read. Hundreds more whose names were never written down, or were written and lost, or were recorded in languages and in places that the archival systems of the American Midwest did not preserve. The Stumps in Sawyer County do not know any of their names, but the Stumps remember the weight of the machine, the iron pressure of an industrial system that moved through this landscape like weather, like geology, like a force of nature that was in fact nothing of the kind. It was a human decision, made in ledger books and legislative chambers and operational memos, prosecuted by men with gauges and firing irons in temperatures that frosted the water glass and stiffened the safety valve stems, in a forest that had stood for centuries and fell in decades. The needle on the pressure gauge has long since stopped moving. The forest is still growing back. It will take a very long time.